let's add a custom recipe type to our custom block entity. Alright, we find ourselves back in IntelliJ once more, and in this tutorial we're going to be adding a custom recipe type to our custom block entity. So last time, of course, we've implemented the block entity with, well, more or less a recipe that is already, well, hard-coded more or less in this case. However, now we're going to make this a custom recipe type so that we can just make JSON files, and then all of those recipes are just going to work. It's going to be absolutely glorious. In our tutorial mod package, we're going to right-click New Package, and this is going to be called the Recipe Package. Now inside there, we need two classes. First one is the Mod Recipes class, and the second one is going to be the Gem Infusing Gem Infusing Recipe. Yeah, there you go. That's actually a great name. Now let's start here. This is going to be quite of a long class, so sort of bear with me. So we're going to implement the recipe. So this is going to be the net Minecraft recipe, absolutely, the interface, and this is of simple inventory. You can hover over this, implement methods. You can see we have to implement quite a few methods over here. And what we also will do is copy over a bunch of stuff. Now, once again, everything here is available to you in the description below, GitHub repository, and individual gist as well. Now, what we'll do is I will just copy over the three fields that we're definitely going to need. That is an identifier, a output, as well as some recipe items. So this would be the input, basically. And then we're going to have a new constructor with all of those things, an ID, right, a output, as well as the recipe items as a default list of ingredient. So then we can basically go through this, and let's actually start roughly at the, start at the bottom and move our way up, because the matches method is actually pretty much the most important method, while the rest is sort of boilerplate code, more or less. So let's start with the type class. So we're going to have a class in here, a static class of type, called type, which implements the recipe type of this particular recipe. Now, this is, once again, just a sort of a boilerplate thing. Just make sure to change the ID right here. That is actually very, very important. And then we're going to have another static class, and that is the serializer. Now, if we actually add this, you can see this is of type recipe serializer, or it implements recipe serializer of this type. Once again, making sure that the ID here is correct. That is very important. This is the name given inside of the JSON file. Make sure that this is done. And then we need to implement three methods, the read, and the write method. Let's implement those, and let's see what those entail. So those entail some interesting things. The read method here is reading the JSON file, while the read and the write method here are for those are for the networking stuff to basically work. Now, I'm just going to start copying over stuff. Let's just copy over the contents of the entire method here, the read method, and then I'm going to explain what this does. So this is going to read the following. First of all, it's going to read a JSON element, right? A JSON object over here that's called output, and it's just going to make sure that this is, well, it's going to convert that output into a item stack. So it's going to say, oh, this is now an item stack, right? And then we have the output basically read in. We're also going to have an array, so it's a JSON array of ingredients, and we're going to basically read those in. Now, we have a defaulted list here of size 1. This means that we're going to only read in one ingredient. This needs to correspond to the number of crafting inputs you have. This is not the number of slots you have. Very important. This is like how many things you want to ever be able to read in. And then also, if you ever want to change this, I'm going to say that like this, you just have to play around with this a little bit. This is pretty much just JSON serialization. So if this is like really interesting to you, there are some things. Number one, you can just look at Java serialization, how that works, right? Java JSON serialization. And then secondly, you can take a look at the, shaped recipe, for example. So you can middle mouse button click on this. This is a crafting recipe, and you actually have this available here somewhere, if I recall correctly. Output from JSON, get item from a JSON object. You have the serializer. So there you go. So we have the read method, and the write method. I cannot recommend this enough. Take a look at the vanilla recipes as well to, basically figure out how this all works, or figure out the JSON serialization itself through Java. And then here we're just setting the inputs and then making a new gem infusing recipe. So this is, of course, one of our examples here in this case, and then the read method and the write method are very interesting, because we're basically, for the read method, we're just reading in the thing that we are putting on in the write method. So what does that mean? Well, basically, we're taking the buffer over here, we're just getting an integer. This is going to be the size of our list, And then we're going to loop through this, and we're just going to say, okay, get me the, the next ingredient, basically. And then at the end here, we're just getting the output. Now, how do I know that this is sort of the way to do it? Well, because we're also having to do the write method. And you can see we're first writing an integer, and then we're first reading an integer. And then we're writing X amount of, ingredients to this buffer. And then we're reading X amount of ingredients from this buffer. And then lastly, we're writing an item stack, which is the output. And here we're reading the item stack. The order and the, things that we're doing here has to match, right? So this is basically networking stuff. If the packet buffer is off by, anything basically, right? If we add another integer and we're not reading it, or we're writing something else, or we're reading something that doesn't exist, you will have an error. Now, you might actually not get this error inside of the environment here, instead of the development environment. This might actually only happen if you have a dedicated server and start it with a dedicated server. So please keep that in mind. Make sure that the write and the read method are basically, mirrors of each other. Okay, and then we can actually go back to the normal class and just do some stuff here. So this is just going to be type.instance. The serializer is, crazily enough, serializer.instance. The ID is just the ID. The output is just output.copy, actually, very important here. Fits, we're just going to say true. The craft method is just going to be the output. And then the matches method is where the magic happens. The first thing we have to do is we have to say world is client. And then we just want to return false. I'm not 100% sure why we have to do this. I just know that we have to do this. Otherwise, it will crash on the server. I don't know why. It's changed like in, I think 1.18.2 or something like that. It changed for whatever reason. I just found that doing this basically, works. So there you go. What else does the matches method do? Well, it basically checks, or what you want to check in here is basically whether or not the recipe items are the same as the items inside of the inventory. This means that we have a list of ingredients right here. It's ever only going to be one ingredient. So basically, we're going to say recipe items.get 0, because this gets us the first ingredient. Remember, arrays and lists and all of that start at 0. And we want to test this against the inventory.get stack of from slot 1. Because we remember, once again, if we look at this is going to be our input slot, right? 0, 1. So this is our slot that we're inputting our item into. That's why this is 1. This is 0 because this is a different list, right? This has nothing to do with the inventory. We're basically getting the first item inside of the list of our ingredients. And this we want to match with whatever is inside of the inventory. And if it does, then we're going to return true, and then the matches method is true, and then we have found a match for a particular recipe in this case. That is the general idea. The matches method can get wildly more complicated, especially if you have multiple input slots and all of that, and multiple input items. What I recommend here, once again, is just Java knowledge. If you have sufficient Java knowledge, then this should not scare you in the slightest, right? If you're like, I don't even know what's going on right now, it might be worth going back to the drawing board a little bit, because especially when we continue along with this, there's going to be quite a few things that are a lot more complicated than this, right? So just keep that in mind. And this, of course, should serve only as an example to you, so that you have one particular implementation, and then you can hopefully expand on this, play around with this, and hopefully be fine with that. So let's continue with the mod recipes method. It's actually not that complicated over here. What we want to do is we just want a public static void register recipes method over here, and this will just call the two things. I'm actually going to copy this over because it's actually fairly straightforward. You can see we have a registry register call of recipe serializers. We're making a new identifier of tutorial mod, and then gem infusing recipe serializer ID. And then just passing in the instance here. And then here, we're doing the same thing, just with the recipe type. Literally all that we need to do. Once again, this is, of course, all available to you in the description below. Get a repository and individual gist as well. And then we just call the mod recipes.register recipes down here, and that should register the recipe as well. Now, that is all fine, and now the registry is the recipe is registered. There you go, that way around. However, it's not currently used in our block entity. The block entity still uses our very crude method of literally just having a boolean over here. Now, how can we fix that? It's actually very straightforward. This is why I've, created this, because it's actually not that, bad. We're just going to want to delete the boolean here, and instead we want to say optional of type gem infusing recipe. This is going to be the match. That is equal to the world. Now we don't have the world. We can just say entity.getWorld dot get recipe manager, this one right here, and we want to say get first match of a particular recipe, that is the gem infusing recipe.type.instance, passing in the inventory as well as the world. So this is once again entity.getWorld. And there we go. Now this basically checks, hey, do we have any type of match? And how do we check for a match? We just say match.isPresent. No math, nope, match.isPresent. There you go. And that pretty much does the same thing. Now, if this is true, then the inventory that we have, right, so this one right here, has found a match with any type of recipe of this particular gem infusing type. That's all that there is to it. So isPresent, match.isPresent is basically true if our matches method is true. So that is why the matches method is so important. Hello, this is future Kaupenjoe here with a little bit of an announcement. It's very important here that we actually do change something else in the craft item method, and that is actually we're going to have to take the optional recipe here in here as well. Let's just call this something like the recipe. And what we actually want to do is, of course, here we still have this particular item stack, in this case hard-coded, so we actually do want to change this. So we can either say, you know, new item stack, and then we can say recipe.get output, you know, item, for example, and then do something like this. Or you can also, because of course the output here is actually already an item stack, so you could in theory also say something like this, right? So either one of those works. I recommended doing something like this. And then what you can also do is you can take the output itself, instead of getting the stack that is inside of here, just taking whatever the output is and adding 1 to it. So you can say get output dot get count in this case, and then adding 1 to this as well. So either way, you know, pretty much this should work as long as you have the correct item here. And then if you're not reading in any count, then that should be fine. If you are reading in a count, then of course be sure to use the item stack that you're using right here. Otherwise, of course, the count is not going to work. So this is actually quite an important, you know, bit that you also have to do. Otherwise, you will get, regardless of the actual regardless of the actual recipe, you're always going to get the tanzanite, which is of course not something you want. That is why this is quite important. I'm going to give it back to past Kaupenjoe, where the code will probably change. However, this is the correct code. Keep that in mind, and everything then should be fine. Even more future Kaupenjoe here. Before we get back to past Kaupenjoe, there's one more thing that we actually need to change. And that is in the can insert into items output slot over here, because we still have the tanzanite right in here. What we actually want to do is we want to say match.get.getOutput.getItem over here. Otherwise, we actually, once again, it won't work. So keep that in mind as well. So sorry for the weird fixes over here, but sometimes, you know, it happens. Block entity is quite complicated, so hopefully you can forgive me for that. Otherwise, back to old Kaupenjoe and to the rest of the video. And that pretty much is everything that we need to do in this case. Everything else doesn't need to change. We only needed to change this because we're using the hasRecipe method. We're using it here as well, so we don't need to change this. And that should pretty much do everything, you know, on its own. We now just need a JSON file. Let's go into our data folder. Tutorial model recipes. We're going to right click new file here, and that's going to be the tanzanite from infusing, or let's call it gem infusing, sure, .json. And I will copy over the contents, but they should be fairly self-explanatory. You can see tutorial mod gem infusing should be nothing crazy, right? The gem infusing right here is the name right here. Let's see, this one right here and this one right here. Nope, this one and this one, right? So those have to match. That's very important. And then we have an ingredient list. So as you can see, this is a JSON area or a JSON list. And then we have an item that is the raw tanzanite, and the output here is the item of tutorial mod tanzanite. So we're basically going to get 1 tanzanite over here from 1 raw tanzanite. That is the general idea. Let's then go into the game and actually see if it works. Alright, found us in Minecraft again, so let's just see. So in theory, I should be able to put the raw tanzanite in here, and we should get the progress again, and we should get a tanzanite out of it. So that's actually perfect, and there we go, we got a tanzanite out of it, exactly how you would expect it to. So you might say, well, that's literally the same behavior that we have before. Yes, but now you can just create the JSON files, and you can basically put any type of item in there, and, well, it's just going to interpret this for you. It's going to do all stuff for you, and that is absolutely freaking awesome. Right, and that would be it for this tutorial right here. I hope you found this useful and you learned something new, and I'll see you all in the next tutorial. So, yeah.